Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs in the Paranormal. I truly appreciate it. Today's episode is called UFOs in Your Hometown. This is a continuing series where I explore various locations provided by you guys. So this is episode 7, UFOs in Your Hometown, episode 7. I'm having a lot of fun doing these episodes. I always learn a lot. They're a bit different from most that I do, and I get to cover a lot more cases. In fact, in this episode, I cover more than 100 separate UFO incidents. And the 7 locations I am exploring today include Folsom, California, Napier, New Zealand, Bountiful, Utah, Hickory, North Carolina, McKinney, Texas, Evansville, Indiana, and finally Kalispell, Montana. These 7 locations really delivered. Thank you guys for suggesting them. They cover the full range of encounters, including sightings, landings, onboard experiences, as well as face-to-face encounters with humanoids. So really all types of UFO encounters, quite a wide variety of cases. And what's also super interesting is, yes, these cases go way back into history, pretty much right up to the current day, but they have a lot of really compelling evidence. So we have cases involving photographs, cases involving radar returns, as well as landing traces, physiological effects, electromagnetic disturbances, animal reactions, and more. A lot of evidence to support all these cases. And again, one of the reasons I'm really doing this is to prove that UFOs are being seen everywhere on this planet. Name a location, name a town or city, and I'm pretty sure I can find a case there. Haven't lost yet. Please have mercy on me if you're going to provide another location for me to explore, because my list is now well over 700 locations. But I'm working my way through it. So let's just get started. And the first location I'm exploring today is Folsom, California. This is by special request from D.F. Smith. So thank you, D.F. I truly appreciate you participating. I found some interesting cases for you. I will say they're all what we would call close encounters of the first kind, sightings. But there's some really interesting ones, some multiple witness cases, and one is just a wow kind of sighting. Very close-up daylight sighting where a UFO buzzes a car at very low level. I think you'll find it interesting. The first case I found in Folsom occurred on August 17, 1960, when an object with 2 bright lights in the front and red lights in the rear was seen hovering over the city for 2 full hours. During this time, witnesses said it was making a whining noise, quote, like a spinning top. Unfortunately, there's no other info on that case, but certainly interesting. Now, throughout 1972, a lady who lived in a rural area located about 3 miles from Folsom Lake kept noticing that her dogs and horses would get restless, and she'd look out the window and she would see 1 or more glowing objects. So when this would happen, she'd call her brothers, who would often come over to see the UFO themselves. And as one of the brothers says, "My 2 brothers and I would drive out to her house, often during the middle of the night. Many times we would see the object before arriving at her house." So the brother says this happened many, many times. These objects would be seen typically late at night or during the very early morning hours. They were always completely silent. And the brother says that one of the best sightings occurred when they were standing at the very edge of the lake, and they saw numerous of these objects hovering and then moving erratically. And at one point he says, and I quote, "One such object actually shot a beam of light directly onto the water. We could see the ripples of the lake water once the beam of light penetrated the lake." Now, a second memorable sighting with these folks occurred in 1972. Once again, after receiving a call from his sister, the brother parked along Sierra College Boulevard and watched 6 or 7 glowing orange orbs moving towards a larger glowing object and appeared to enter it. They would then reappear and events would start all over again. And as the witness says, We watched this phenomena repeat itself for nearly an hour, as I recall. What we saw wasn't certainly anything that is easily explained. Now here's another very impressive close-up encounter which occurred just before noon on August 6, 1980. The witnesses are Phyllis Umura and Joan Boffner. They were driving north on Folsom Boulevard just before it goes under Highway 50, you can see it here, when Phyllis looked up and saw a strange craft. And she pointed to it and said, "What's that over there? Is that an airplane?" So her friend Joan looked at it and said, "No, I don't think so." And this is when the object suddenly dropped from the sky and headed right for them. And Phyllis shouted out, "It's coming at us." And Joan says, and I quote, "And it was, right towards us. And then there it was, right above us, no more than 10 or 15 feet above us. It was kind of saucer-like, but more oval, more oblong than round. The exterior was silver, and had these little holes in the bottom. And looking up into them, all you could see was blackness. It wasn't making any noise at all. It was just there, hovering over our heads." Now, Joan is a good witness. She worked as a secretary at Aerojet's Minuteman missile program. Phyllis is also a good witness. She was an executive secretary in the quality control office at the same company. And as Joan says, "I wouldn't make up any tale like that. I don't know what it was, but it was not an airplane, and it was not a helicopter." Another interesting case comes from New Fork, the National UFO Reporting Center, and involves 5 witnesses who, they say, at 7 p.m. on August 24, 2005, were boating at Folsom Lake. A lot of cases at this particular location. Now these witnesses were in their boat parallel to Folsom Dam when right above the dam they saw a, quote, "white cylindrical craft." Said it was almost directly above them. As the witness says, it appeared still at first, then slowly moved away from the dam. In no way did it appear to be a plane. It was in the sky for a good minute when our friend fell in the water. We took our eyes off of the craft for no more than 5 seconds. Then, when we looked back, it had disappeared. So 10 minutes later, as they were returning to the dock, they saw this strange object again. And as the witness says, suddenly the same craft was directly above us. It had appeared there in practically an instant. Then it moved toward the dam at a faster speed. We eventually lost sight of the craft. But following this sighting, they did see a helicopter appear and apparently follow the path of the craft. They had the impression it was looking for it. And here is another case from Folsom Lake. This one occurred on June 4th, 2016. It was around 7:45 p.m., and a man was walking his dog in this area when he saw a, quote, "circular object." He said it was stationary in the sky just below the cloud layer, and after watching it for about 5 minutes and unable to identify it, he went to his house nearby and got a pair of binoculars. And as he says, "As I viewed the object with my binoculars, I could see a slight glint or light on the western side of the object. Suddenly, the object vanished. I had the strange feeling that the object knew I was observing it when it disappeared." So there you go, D.F. Smith. Not a whole lot of cases, but definitely some interesting ones. All the way up to 2016 as well, so fairly recent. Found it super interesting that a couple of them were in the same exact location, Folsom Lake. UFOs do seem to be attracted to bodies of water, and certainly lots of cases of UFOs over dams and hydroelectric stations and this kind of thing. So there's a pattern there for sure. Now let's move to the next location, Napier, New Zealand. This is by special request from Alan Roser. And I have to thank you, Alan, because I found some really interesting cases in this one. More than a dozen, including one case that actually resulted in a person going to court. So that case is particularly interesting. But yeah, some really amazing encounters. The first significant case that I could find in Napier, New Zealand occurred at 3:30 a.m. on December 16, 1952. The main witness was Cedric Burkell, a logging contractor, and he was driving on the Taupo Road towards Napier when he noticed 6 cigar-shaped glowing objects. Quite large, he says each was about the apparent size of a full moon, and they were scooting through the sky in a straight line. As Cedric says, I stopped the truck thinking that I was tired and that perhaps my eyes were playing tricks. I walked around the truck and then looked again. The objects were still there, 6 of them, traveling one behind another. They were yellow in color and were traveling on a course horizontal to the sea. Suddenly they lifted, still in the same formation and without changing the regularity of their spacing, and continued on as before. He said they were moving pretty slowly, maybe 30 to 40 miles per hour, but were quite high up, 10,000 to 15,000 feet altitude, and he watched them for about 5 minutes until they disappeared off into the distance. It was 1 year later, 6:30 p.m. on June 3rd, 1953, when a group of Boy Scouts at Napier's saw a yellow-white glowing object. They estimated it was about 7,000 feet in altitude, moving towards the north. But per the Boy Scouts, the object had a very unusual shape and, quote, resembled a chair. So I don't know what the heck that was. But sightings continued. 2 years later, on the night of November 22nd, 1955, more than 20 people along the embankment road between Napier and West Shore stopped to observe a brilliant green sphere, which they said was hovering stationary in the sky. Among the witnesses were Mr. D. McDonald and his family. They were part of a convoy of vehicles who actually pulled over off the road and watched as this sphere began to revolve. It changed to a red color. It then moved behind a cloud and out the other side, moving to the east slowly. All in total, it remained in view for about 5 minutes, when suddenly it moved off at a terrific speed, which pretty much ruled out any explanation such as plane, planet, star, or other conventional object or recognizable phenomenon. 2 years later, there was a rare daylight disk sighting. This occurred at 11 a.m. on January 6, 1957. The main witness is Mrs. McEdwin, and she reported her sighting of what she described as a dark, round craft silhouetted against a white cloud directly over Napier. She watched it as it, quote, executed 2 quick wide turns and then with a wide curve disappeared eastwards. Now that same day, exactly 12 hours later at 11 p.m., a Mr. Hatton of Napier described his sighting of a, quote, ball of red fire like a flaming onion. He said he watched it for 5 minutes as it changed from red to yellow and then appeared to eject 3 smaller objects. At this point, all 4 moved off in the direction of Bayview and were lost to sight. The next significant sighting that I could find occurred at 3:15 p.m. on May 23, 1961. The witness is E.M. Church, who was on Chaucer Road sitting on her doorstep when, as she says, and I quote, I saw a round silvery object in the sky. It was very large and shaped like one of those round rubber rafts or a flower bowl. It appeared from a northerly direction and moved very slowly in a straight line until it reached the beacon's airdrome. Then it suddenly disappeared. I watched for a long time, but it did not reappear. Now, a very widely viewed sighting over Napier, apparently seen by crowds of people, occurred from 9:10 to 9:35 p.m. on August 25, 1967. An object that was described as bright orange-pink, oblong in shape, and flashing lights, and transparent, was seen hovering over the city. They said it appeared over a hill moving like a rocket. It was twice the size of a normal star. Some did say it was shaped like a parachute, but as it moved over Napier, it divided into 2 and then disappeared over or into the ocean. One witness said he watched it through binoculars for a full 10 minutes. He estimated its height at about 1,000 feet, so pretty low. But among the witnesses were 5 police officers. So this is a pretty well-verified sighting. And in fact, the crew of a boat along the coast not only saw the object, they captured it on radar. They did a search of the area where they saw it go down, but could find no trace of it. Now here is one of the most interesting and unusual cases coming out of Napier, and this involves 19-year-old John Dow and his friend Paul Franklin. Dow's encounter actually resulted in his arrest for dangerous driving. It began with a series of sightings. At 9:30 p.m. on September 6, 1968, John Dow and his friend Paul Franklin were driving when they noticed 20 or maybe even 30 colored lights, green and red. They were, quote, flying aimlessly above the dump. So they pulled over to watch when they heard a, quote, thunderous explosion. And they saw these lights group together and shoot straight upwards into the sky at high speed. This really impressed them. They called the police. The policeman said that what he had seen was probably flashing power cables. They went back the next night. There was nothing there, but 2 nights later, on the 8th, they went back there and saw a small light rise up from a field, hover at 1,000 feet altitude, expand in size, and disappear. But events came to a dramatic climax on September 10, 1968. John Dow and his friend Paul Franklin were driving away from the garbage dump along Springfield Road, Highway 50, when they noticed a strange red light in the sky, which then turned to a greenish color. Now, before they knew it, suddenly this object was zooming directly towards them. Paul screamed out in fear, "Bail out! It's got us!" And in fact, this object, they said, buzzed the car at very close range. Both John and Paul leaped from the vehicle, which was still moving. They estimated about 35 miles per hour. Paul landed on his back, John landed on his chest, and the car, of course, zoomed off on its own. And they said this object, this glowing object, was hovering about 2 feet above it. Paul screamed out, the light, and covered his eyes because it was so brilliant he thought it might blind him. John tried to get up, but his friend Paul stopped him and said, "For God's sake, stay down. They are after us." So off the car went on its own, and it crashed into a fruit shop on Gloucester Street. This was 400 to 500 feet down the road, and pretty much totaled the car and caused significant damage to the shop. Soon a crowd of people came to help the boys, who were both briefly hospitalized at Napier Hospital, treated for bruises and abrasions, no serious injuries. But John, who was driving at the time, or as it turned out not driving, ended up in court for dangerous driving. And he pled not guilty. Police Constable Barry Martin Buss testified that he was at the scene and confirmed that both boys were in a, quote, hysterical condition. Judge W.K.L. Dugal heard the case and ended up acquitting John Dow of the charge, saying that it was clearly an accident. But he then said, quote, "Most of these lights people see have a natural cause. The flying saucer in hot pursuit might have been the light of a car coming around the corner," which is a pretty ridiculous debunking explanation, given that these 2 witnesses said that they saw this light 2 feet over their car. At any rate, that's a very interesting case, and it's not the only one, because 1 year later, on the night of October 30, 1969, Patrol Officer Cudby saw a disc in a field 300 feet away, apparently landed on the ground or hovering right above it. He shone his spotlight back and forth on it 3 times, during which time his patrol dog, he said, became unusually excited. Now, the officer was close enough to hear a dull, swishing sound coming from this object. At this point, the object made a high-pitched whine and moved off. So the officer went directly to the spot to investigate and saw that although this field was pretty wet with dew, there was a 60-foot wide area where the disc had been that was now hot and dry. So it's a pretty significant landing trace case. 1 year later, October 3rd, 1970, a couple was sitting in their car along the coast at Marine Parade when they saw no less than 8 glowing objects approaching from the east, moving to the west at very low altitude, about 300 feet, they estimate. They said they moved slowly enough that they remained visible for 20 minutes. The next day, 3 young people said that they were driving on Magdalen Crescent when they saw 4 objects move in formation overhead, staying in view for 30 seconds. 2 months later, on December 30, 1970, 3 freighter workers by the name of Charlie Orbell, John Clark, and Jeff Miller noticed a strange object, which they described as long, thin, bright silver, glistening in the sky. They said it remained stationary overhead for a good 10 minutes and then moved to the left and then shot away at high speed. There was another witness some miles away. Mr. D.L. Grindell was on Oliphant Road, and he reported seeing what he described as a silver-white disc. This was at the same time as the above sighting. Now, the year of 1972 was a huge year for UFOs in Napier. On May 18, 1972, student John Collins was at his home on Bluff Hill when he and his mother used a telescope to observe 2 lights. This was in the evening. One of these lights was stacked over the other, and both were sending down beams of lights, appearing to search the hills in sort of a zigzag pattern. And as John says, it was fantastically bright. They behaved too peculiarly to be anything normal. 3 months later, on August 20, 1972, Chris Barker and Mark Dobson, who were members of the St. Augustine Church Youth Club, were taking some friends home when they were stopped by a girl at the corner of Meany and Tannery Roads who wanted them to look at, quote, UFOs. And as Chris Barker says, they were over the fields, one above the other, and were joining and coming apart. They had revolving lights and were moving all the time. So after dropping off their friends, Chris Barker and Mark Dobson returned to the site and the objects were still there but much higher in the sky. Word spread quickly and soon some 50 members of the youth club observed these objects. So pretty widely viewed and definitely unexplained. It was 3 weeks later, on September 14, 1972, that Bill Appleby, age 16, was at his home located at 85 Latham Street in Napier when he saw a UFO from his front porch. As he says, I was looking out to sea when I saw a bright, piercing light hovering up and down. It moved west and then back to the original position. The object then moved up into the clouds, and it looked like a dumbbell standing on end, with 2 bright piercing lights and a soft red pulsating light in between. So going to do his milk run, he saw that this object was now hovering about 100 feet above Bluff Hill. He says he watched it for a total of 7 minutes before it disappeared. One final case in Napier occurred at 10:15 p.m. on December 30, 1979, when a former World War II serviceman and his wife were taking a walk at the beach along Marine Parade when they saw what they described as a star-like light moving and then dropping erratically downwards in a falling leaf motion, and then it disappeared. So they thought that it might have been a meteor, but then suddenly a silver-orange spherical object appeared, maneuvered in a large half circle, and shot off to the south. This was immediately followed by a second object which made the same maneuver and shot off at twice the speed of the first object and joined it. Both objects then moved off to the south and disappeared into the distance. So clearly not a meteor or shooting star. And in fact, Dr. Jan de Bach of the New Zealand UFO Studies Center interviewed the witnesses and was unable to identify the lights and concluded that they had seen 2 genuine UFOs. Thank you again, Alan Roser. It was a lot of fun to explore Napier. It looks like a really beautiful place and certainly does have a lot of encounters. I was really hoping I could find some humanoid cases for you. I suspect there are some there. But again, the closer the encounter is, most people do not report it. I think this is why most of the cases we do see that are documented are close encounters of the first kind. But it's still proving my point that UFOs are seen everywhere on this planet. Now let's move to another location, which is Bountiful, Utah. Thank you to Monkey McBean for providing this location. Pretty interesting. It's fairly large city, so I really expected to find more than I did, but I found only 2 cases. Nevertheless, I think you will find them interesting and compelling. Today, the city of Bountiful has a current population of about 40,000 people, but only a few UFO reports have come from this area. One that I found occurred on May 2nd, 1969 at 11:20 p.m. 2 19-year-old men were at a drive-in theater, actually, when they saw 2 round, yellow-orange objects hovering near North Canyon. One of these objects moved rapidly to the east. The second one hovered for a few moments and then moved slowly after the other one and disappeared. So these are anomalous lights at night, a bit ambiguous, but apparently unexplained. Another Bountiful case occurred fairly recently, 9:10 p.m., October 10, 2019, and this was captured on camera. Per the witness, and I quote, "I observed a cluster of approximately 50 bright orange lights enter the atmosphere over Antelope Island. I thought a large meteor had broken up in the atmosphere, but then they hovered in a cluster and changed direction toward the east. The cluster of lights disappeared, and a bright white light was left in their place hovering. I then observed several bright white lights blinking in a sequential pattern in a straight line as they hovered. I reached for my cell phone and was able to capture some of this amazing event." So the photograph you see here is a still frame of this. And yes, it just shows a light in the sky, but it is photographic evidence. And in fact, the case was investigated by Utah MUFON State Director Michael Barrett, who closed the case as an unknown. FYI, there is a military base near there, but the witness says he's familiar with the base and has never seen lights like this before. Turned out that same day, somebody videoed a cluster of bright orange lights over North Carolina, and the witness was able to see this videotape and said it was, quote, "exactly what I saw." Thank you, Monkey McBean. That was pretty interesting. Yeah, 2 cases. I'm sure that there's a whole lot more there. So if anyone lives in Bountiful, Utah, you can send your cases my way, because I know with a city of that size, there's definitely a lot more cases there. But now let's move to our next location, which is Hickory, North Carolina. This is by special request from UFO Bigfoot. Thank you, UFO Bigfoot. It was pretty interesting. North Carolina is a fairly active state. I found 4 significant cases. Again, in each of these locations, I'm discarding the cases that are very brief, involving anomalous lights and don't have a whole lot of information to provide. So again, this shouldn't be considered a comprehensive listing of every single encounter on record at these locations, but certainly the significant ones. So I hope you find this interesting. The first case from Hickory, North Carolina that I could find occurred at 8:45 p.m. on August 13, 1952. The witness is James Stone. He had recently graduated from high school, and he was outside his home located at 312 7th Street Southwest in Hickory, and this is when he saw a glowing orange object, which he says was about the apparent size of a full moon, shaped like a disc or a mushroom, and he said it was moving on edge, and it went from horizon to horizon in a period of about 5 seconds. Very fast. He said it appeared to be at only 1,000 feet altitude and was totally silent. Turns out he's not the only witness to it, because unknown to James, just a short distance away at 137 9th Street, another recent high school graduate, Larry Eisenhower, saw the object as well. He said he had it in view for about 4 seconds. Both boys reported their sighting to authorities. It reached William H. Chambly, the Director of Civil Defense for the City of Hickory, who remained somewhat neutral about the sightings, saying, quote, "While I do not believe that the objects sighted are the so-called flying saucers, I am convinced that these boys actually saw some phenomenon, like a trick of atmosphere." Certainly a good trick. Next case occurred 7 years later. It was around 4 a.m. on November 3rd, 1959, when Robert L. Jones and his friend were driving outside of Statesville, North Carolina. This is about 30 miles from Hickory, when they said a blue ball of light chased their car at treetop level for several miles. And as James says, I stopped 6 times and it stopped 6 times. I don't mind telling you I was scared to death. Now finally it darted off and he reported it to the police, and this is when they found out that numerous residents in the area, including in Salisbury and of course Hickory, had also called their local police station to report unusual lights in the sky. Next case I found occurred at 9:30 p.m. on March 19, 1978, when 5 young ladies from Hickory, ranging in age from 9 to 15 years old, called the police to report their sighting of a glowing object which they saw circling above Lenoir Rhine College. The group included Flo Ripley, Connie Miller, Tony Kiley, Kelly Gwynn, and Heather Livengood. Flo Ripley was kind of the spokesperson for the group, said that the object was, quote, about 10 feet long with 2 tails on the back, had 2 bright white lights, it went straight up and then the white lights turned to red, it circled with no sound, no noise at any time, then one light turned to green and disappeared. So they watched it for about 5 minutes, and this is when they called the police, who they said were not very enthusiastic about the report, though it did reach newspaper reporters and was later published in the Hickory Record newspaper. 2 years later, on the night of April 10, 1980, Leanne Sane was driving from Hickory to Vail when she reported her sighting of a round golden sphere flying overhead. No sooner did she see it when, to her shock, this object came down and circled her car, and proceeded to do this for the next 30 miles, all the way on her trip from Hickory to Vail. Researcher Fawcett investigated the incident, and he learned that there were in fact other sightings in the surrounding area on that same night. UFOs do seem to have this thing about chasing cars down lonely highways at night, because it happened again. 9 p.m., October 26, 1983, David Keener called the police to say that he saw a diamond-shaped UFO swoop down over his car as he was traveling along Highway 321 just northeast of Hickory. He said this object was silent, it looked red in front and kind of green in the back, and he watched it for 5 minutes as it hovered and then moved to a higher elevation and then off into the distance and was gone. We've already covered a couple of cities in North Carolina, so it doesn't surprise me that Hickory has cases as well. Certainly interesting. But now let's move to our next location, which is McKinney, Texas. I actually got 2 requests for McKinney, and they come from friend Hollis and from Larry. So this is for you guys. I found 3 cases. 2 are really astonishing cases. Again, no humanoids. A little disappointed. Usually I do find more humanoids in each of these locations. But it is what it is. And again, these cases do prove that UFOs are being seen everywhere. And I think you'll find these particular cases quite interesting and extensive. Here is a very important case, I think, which began at 3 p.m. on April 4, 1956. Definitely something undeniably strange was seen for about 6 hours on that day over McKinney. Various witnesses described it as a rounded silvery object with a kind of walnut shape, and it was hovering very high in a clear blue sky. The main witness is very reputable, very credible. He's a U.S. Army Captain, Roy F. Hall, a local weather observer in McKinney, and one-time mayor of the city, actually. He was downtown when some electrical workers called his attention to this object, which was hovering in the northwest sky. Now, he glanced at it, didn't really take a close look, and told them it was undoubtedly a weather balloon. But soon he was going to change his mind, because as Captain Hall says, however, on arriving home, I noted the object again, and was astonished to see that it was above the cirrus clouds that had drifted over within the last hour. Knowing the clouds were at around 11,000 feet up, I ran a triangulation on the object, taking one reading at home and another 3 miles north. And I was amazed again to find it worked out at around 100,000 feet. I took another triangulation at home and found it at the same height. Some quick figuring, after ascertaining the diameter of the object, it showed it to be 220 feet or thereabouts in diameter. So the chase was on. He called Fort Worth Weather Bureau, who confirmed that they had no weather balloons in the area. He called an astronomer in the area who viewed it through his telescope and actually drew the sketch you can see here. He said it had an almost silvery, rubber-like appearance, kind of translucent almost. It did have a very visible vertical band down the center, and it was not revolving in the sky. At this point, it was moving to the southwest at about 100 miles per hour, which was very odd because the air currents at that altitude were moving from west to east at 150 miles an hour. So, Captain Hall made various phone calls to Air Force bases. He got no answers other than that they thought it was a weather balloon. But he's a weather observer. He's very familiar with balloons. He said it was not a weather balloon. It was too bright, too large, too high, and moving too strangely to be a weather balloon. And as he says, I have no idea what it was. Long after sunset, it glowed in the sky due to the sun's rays. It stood in the northwest sky from 3 p.m. until dark, despite its westward course. Hundreds of people here saw it. So the local police station reported that they were, quote, swamped with calls. So this was clearly unusual and very widely viewed. People over an area of 100 miles saw this thing. Now reportedly, Perrin Air Force Base scrambled jets after it. Captain Hall sent a letter to the Air Force, and Project Blue Book got in on the act and ultimately labeled it unidentified but possibly Venus or weather phenomenon. 10 days later, Captain Hall was visiting this same astronomer's house and saw 2 red lights shoot over the horizon. And he later found another witness who on the same night said he saw 3 pale blue lights about 150 feet above the ground moving at extremely high speed across the sky. He estimated about 1,800 miles per hour. Here's another pretty interesting case from McKinney, which comes from researcher Brian Veik, who took a report from a couple. They said at 11:45 a.m. on October 18, 2008, they were driving their kids to soccer and saw an unusual-looking, quote, silver metallic cigar-shaped object. As they said, it didn't move and it was hovering high in the sky. It was not an airplane or a helicopter or a balloon. It seemed to go high up and we lost sight of it. 1 minute it was there and the next it was gone. Such are UFOs. Now here is a really interesting, very important case involving physical evidence. This is actually a UFO landing case, which was investigated by Texas State Director for MUFON, Gary Neitzel. It's a case with deeper levels of contact, as we shall see. Because over the past year, the witnesses reported seeing strange green flashes of light in the sky, weird star-like objects moving around. Turned out so had their neighbors, and was following one of these sightings that the main witness says he woke up with odd marks on his skin, which he felt were not naturally caused. You can see them here. But it was really around midnight on December 1st, 2018 that this witness, a mechanical engineer for a large military defense subcontractor, had an encounter that left him deeply shaken. He was in his upstairs music room. For some reason, got up to look out the window, which faces north over an open field, and he saw something so shocking, so unbelievable, he could hardly believe his own eyes. As he says, what I saw literally frightened me so much that I was almost paralyzed, and I could barely talk to myself. I started trembling, and my eyes could not believe what they were seeing. But essentially what I saw was a UFO from 500 feet away. The thing was incredibly big, and the first thing I thought when I saw it was UFO. Now this thing was on the ground, and per the witness, it had a horizontal string of 20 large ice white-blue lights, which were surrounded by smaller red lights. The witness had the impression that the lights were deliberately pointed at his house. Says the witness, The color and brightness of those lights were so clean and powerful that I have never seen anything man-made that looks similar. So he watched in absolute shock and astonishment for a full 40 seconds, then realized he should probably get another witness. He dashed downstairs to get his wife, who was asleep. Then he ran back upstairs with her. They both looked out the window, and this object was still there. He estimated it was probably about 30 feet wide, maybe 16 feet tall. At this point, he decided to go get a pair of binoculars. And no sooner did he leave the window in the room that his wife yelled out, "It's moving!" And she watched it move to the east very slowly and disappeared behind the neighbor's house. So some minutes later, the couple got into their car and drove around the neighborhood looking for it, but it was gone. The next morning they did go out into the field, and they found, as you can see here, crushed, burned vegetation and strange imprints on the ground. Following this encounter, they contacted MUFON researcher Gary Neitzel, who interviewed the witnesses, and he says that the husband, quote, seemed very credible and was somewhat shaken by what he had seen. They tested the area for radiation with a Geiger counter, found no radiation, but did confirm the landing traces and did take soil samples and samples of the vegetation. They were sent to analysis which showed, quote, damage from unusual vibration frequencies, as are sometimes seen in some crop circles, as well as charring of the outer membranes. And as the main researcher Gary says, after interviewing the witness in person and inspecting the possible landing or hovering site, the investigators believe that some unknown strange object had either landed in or hovered over this field. So while these are all sightings, one is a landing, and it does have indications of this being a much more extensive encounter, or encounters, I should say. So again, this is just the tip of the iceberg in each of these cases. The history of UFO visitations on our planet is far more extensive and is completely excluded from pretty much all history books. This subject is very, very rarely taught in any school classrooms. There are a few cases of people being taught UFOs in school, but not in regular textbooks. It's completely absent. Hopefully that will one day change. It's one of the reasons I do this research. This is a very important subject. So now let's move to our next location, which really delivered the full range of encounters. I found 17 cases in this location alone, which is Evansville, Indiana. Indiana has got a lot of activity, I have to say. So thank you, Bruce Wright, for suggesting this location. It was so interesting. I learned a lot, and I think you will find it interesting as well. I certainly hope so. The first case that I found in Evansville, Indiana, is an amazing one. It occurred in August of 1953. It is a single witness case. There's not a whole lot of verification to it, but it's so interesting that it definitely deserves to be known. The witness was 6 years old, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Lane, and I'll just quote him directly. As he says, "As a child of 6 years old, I was playing in the alley beside our home on the 400 block of 3rd Street in Evansville on a day in August of 1953. My mother was in the kitchen at the sink which overlooked the alley where I was playing. I heard a loud humming sound overhead. There was a large silvery colored globe, approximately 100 feet in diameter, over a tree besides the alley, about 50 feet in the air. A loud humming sound was coming from it. The globe had a band of portal windows that circled around the globe. Humanoid figures were peering out these portals, watching me play. My mother, seeing this craft, sent for my father to bring me in the house. She called the police. Numerous police cars arrived in moments. The police began firing at the globe with rifles, pistols, and shotguns. This went on for about an hour. The craft never seemed to be hit or damaged. Then it finally just went straight up into the air until it disappeared." So yeah, this is quite an event, and the witness says that he actually saved some of the shell casings. He filled them up in a large bushel basket and kept them for some time though as a freshman in high school, for some reason he just threw them away. This case was investigated by a MUFON field investigator who says, and I quote, "Mr. Lane definitely remembers his described event as a child. No record of this event has been found by the Evansville paper and was apparently never reported by the news media at the time. Based on witnesses' data and response, we can only call this report, quote, unknown with insufficient evidence." This case from Evansville, Indiana occurred on August 25, 1955, which as it turns out is just a few days after the very famous Hopkinsville case in Kentucky, and really not too far away. This one does involve humanoids. Charles Thomas, age 17, and several other teenagers were at the local high school in Evansville when they said they saw strange, quote, little green men. These clearly not human figures were running around the school's athletic field. And per the witnesses, they appeared bright green, almost glowing slightly, had sort of a blurry or fuzzy appearance. They were quite short, 4 feet tall, and appeared to have webbed hands and feet, but were humanoids. Very curious about them, the teenagers threw rocks at these creatures, who stopped, stared back at them, and then loped off into the darkness and were gone. A very interesting case. And it was 2 years later, on August 7, 1957, that police stations all across central and eastern Indiana were flooded with calls from people reporting multicolored UFOs. Red, blue, green, pink, and more. One of the calls came from 4 teenagers who said that they were on a camping trip in Evansville when they saw a glowing object which came right overhead, stopped in midair, and seemed to give off a shower of what they called gleaming stardust. Certainly an interesting case. A lot of cases in Evansville. It was 2 years after this, October 2nd, 1959. John Smith was in his home located at 207 South Grand, Evansville, when he saw a, quote, flying saucer over his home. He said it looked like, quote, a big silver pencil with red taillights. He's a young child. He said it was about 300 feet up, 60 feet long, and his friend Larry Haley was with him and also, of course, saw the object. Larry said it looked like a, quote, pencil on its side with blunt ends and a flashing taillight. He estimated it was a little bit shorter, 40 feet long. Neither of them saw any windows or markings on the object. Both said it hovered in perfect silence for about 40 seconds. And then, as John says, it went straight up, still on its side. It went slowly at first, and then fast. Within a few seconds, it was out of sight. So clearly something quite unusual. Here's a really interesting case involving both electromagnetic disturbances and animal reactions, which occurred on the evening of August 10, 1963, and was seen by at least 3 people in Evansville. Marilyn Wiebert was driving with her child and her niece, who at the time was 15 years old. Her niece is Rosita Galloway, and they were about 4 miles north of Evansville, driving along Broom Road, when they said this glowing UFO began to circle around their car. And as Marilyn says, it stayed there maybe 4 or 5 minutes, was white, and reminded me of a flashlight, but it was bigger than anything I ever saw, and was so high up in the air. But per Marilyn, her car engine actually failed. The headlights would not go on, despite repeated attempts to get the car to work. It wouldn't. And dogs in the area, she said, were barking like crazy. Marilyn's young child screamed when this UFO appeared, very frightened, hid on the floor of the car. Rosita looked at it, and as she says, when I looked up, I saw the light disappearing, and then the car worked okay. So this is a pretty clear-cut case of an electromagnetic disturbance, and later it was learned that dozens of people had been reporting strange activity in the sky in that area around that time. Here's the sighting of a very unusual object which occurred on the evening of September 8, 1968. A woman and her son were returning by car to their Evansville home when they saw, quote, an odd sight. As the anonymous witness says, I glanced up and saw a UFO. I could see every detail. At first I thought it was an advertising gimmick. It was in the sky, not moving, and had it been more rounded and streamlined, I thought it was a blimp or the like, but it was long-shaped, darkish in color, and definitely not streamlined. The object did not appear to be tall enough in height to hold an upright man, and if a human being was inside, he would have very likely had to be sitting, at least to fit into the flat-looking shape. The object was long, however, about the length of an airplane, and looked very old, very heavy metal, a dull brown, with smudges that appeared to have been made by great heat. It was a lead color, with smudges as if it had been on fire at one time. It was very ugly. The thing did not seem to have windows, but along both the top and bottom there was a row of squares, set waffle-like back into the metal, and along between the squares was a band running from one end to the other. So yeah, that's all her description. A very unusual object. Not sure what is attracting UFOs to Evansville, but there's a lot of cases. Here's another. April 20, 1970. A witness was traveling north on Route 57 when he noticed a cloud of dust in a farmer's field, and right above it, maybe 200 feet in the air, was a, quote, silvery disc-shaped object. He estimates it was about a quarter mile away, and as he watched it, it was traveling parallel to the ground. He was close enough that he could clearly see portholes or windows on top of the craft, and as the witness says, I have never seen anything like this before, and have never seen anything like it since. It was totally unmistakable for anything other than a classic disc-shaped UFO. 3 years later, November 16, 1973, at 9:45 p.m., 3 teenagers described their sighting of a strange object which they watched drop from the sky, land on the ground, rise up, and land again, and start moving along. So they ran up to it, actually tried to catch this thing as it was traveling along about 10 feet above the ground and occasionally coming even lower than that. They said it had a round, sort of electronic eye-looking device on it. It had a glowing red bottom section that reminded them of a basket. They did tell their parents, who reported it to authorities. Just a few months later, January 25, 1974, David Goodnow, who would later become a very famous news anchorman for CNN, reported his sighting of 3 glittering red-colored objects, which he described as being like an illuminated sign, but very bright, and it had smaller white lights on each side. These lights were totally silent and blinking at random, and moved to the north for several minutes. Reportedly, the cameraman also saw them. And as these objects moved off, they moved in such a way that indicated that these were actually separate objects, not connected together. Here's an interesting case involving missing time. This comes from researcher Francis Ridge, who talked to 4 people who were driving at 9 p.m. on February 9, 1974, just north of Evansville, when they said a UFO came down over their car and actually levitated it upwards. All 4 immediately lost consciousness. When they woke up, they were missing some 2 hours of time. Now, one of the people in the car said that he did recall seeing a human-looking figure on board the UFO who somehow knew all 4 of their names. Unfortunately, I have no other information on this very interesting case. But yeah, something strange is going on in Evansville. Year after year, there are sightings there. Here's another. July 27, 1975, Mike Webb, age 12, who lived at 711 Ravenwood Drive, and his friend Jeff Hatfield, age 10, who lived at 414 Monroe Street, were walking home along Riverside Drive. This is when they saw a UFO, which they estimate was about 4,000 feet high. And as Mike says, I've never seen anything like it before. It was spinning and turning colors, from blue to green to red to yellow. We watched it for 20 minutes, just moving up and down and back and forth. Then it disappeared. It sounds like a true, honest-to-God UFO display to me. Now this next case is a doozy. Francis Ridge, the researcher, calls this case, quote, one of the strangest UFO sighting reports I've personally investigated. The main witness is quite credible. His name is Lee Golden. He's a former Navy man, a Teamster, who was very well known in his community for his philanthropy, giving away free bikes to anyone who wanted one. The sighting occurred at 7:05 p.m. on August 28, 1976. Lee was in his home on the east side of Emmett Street when this object appeared. And as Lee says, this is no hallucination. This thing came right over the top of the house. I'd say 100 to 150 feet over the top of the house. It was rectangular on top, and it had a big light at the bottom. There wasn't any noise at all. As it came over, it was gaining altitude, and it was heading north. When it got way up in the air, something shot out of the bottom of it. Something shot out of it later on. So you can see the drawing here. As Lee Golden says, the object had a rectangular-shaped cage of some sort on the top portion, and it looked very clearly like some sort of cylinder or entrance from top to bottom located in the middle. I also noticed what appeared to be a door or heavy screened opening at the top part located in the middle. The lights had a yellow cast and went to white. The object was moving very slow at first, and then seemed to stop, head from due north to northeast, took on a quick speed, went up a good distance, ejecting something, went higher up and did this again. So he was not the only witness. 5 other people besides Lee also saw this object, which they estimate was in view for about 15 minutes before departing. Certainly a very unusual sighting of a very unusual object. 2 years later, April 7, 1978, 3 boys saw what first appeared to be 2 lights, but quickly this became 4 lights, and then a blue light appeared between all of these and flashed 7 or 8 times at the same time, made a significant beeping sound. The witnesses said this object was huge, about as big as a jet, and very low, maybe 200 to 300 feet high. They were close enough, 250 feet away, that they got a pretty good look at whatever this was. They were not able to identify it. Another interesting case. One night in January or February 1980, a registered nurse was walking her dog not too far from Gress Regional Airport when she said she saw this motionless, shiny, aluminum-looking object very low in the sky, not much higher than the treetops. She kept her eye on it because it looked unusual, kind of blimp-like, but didn't look like a blimp, so she was really wondering what it could be. And it remained in the sky for a long time and was still there when she returned home and finished walking her dog. She said it had a row of lights or portholes and was totally silent. But yeah, not a blimp, she didn't think. The next morning, in fact, she was so intrigued by it, she decided to call the airport, who seemed especially interested in her report. And as she says, the airport people asked me many questions, so I knew then it was a UFO. This next case comes from a letter written to J. Allen Hynek about a UFO seen at 8:45 p.m. on July 23, 1981. In her letter to J. Allen Hynek, the witness, Ann Betulius, who you can see here, writes that she was fishing from a rowboat when she saw a ball of light like an oversized moon, an estimated 10 to 12 feet in diameter, so it was pretty big. And as Ann says, when I first saw the reflection of it in the water, it was moving from east to west. It was on the other side of some trees, so I thought it was an optical illusion and was a helicopter some distance away, but there was no sound. I continued fishing, and I have no concept of how much time elapsed before it came over the trees from the east. I caught the light out of the corner of my eyes and turned to see the object moving over the treetops and move slowly towards the lake. It seemed to come about 3 feet off the ground and about 4 or 5 feet from the edge of the water. It just stood still and was making no sound. It did not change color or brightness. It began to move slowly away back over the trees towards the east, just opposite of its approach. She said it moved very slowly, very smoothly, and then was gone. She does say that both she and her husband had seen unusual bright lights earlier on several prior occasions, but didn't think too much of it until she had this very close encounter. Here's another very unusual sighting which occurred at 3:30 a.m. on September 6, 1986. The witness is known only as Mr. P. He heard this very loud sound like a jet, and turning around, he and his friend saw a huge, long, skinny object, lower than treetop level, moving at about 3 miles per hour past them, very slowly. They saw it come out from behind a tree and then started to move behind a house. But this object was so long, they estimated about 55 feet long, maybe 6 feet in diameter, that they never saw the whole thing. It was still coming out from behind the tree as it moved off behind another house. And this was just 1,000 feet away, very close. It was roughly cigar-shaped, they said. It had red, blue, and green lights. It had what looked like fins on it. Now, earlier that same evening, 3 other people in Evansville had seen 4 extremely red, brilliant lights moving in formation for about 15 seconds. And one of the witnesses said, "We were awe-stricken at their brilliance." So I'm not sure about the first sighting there, but very interesting. Here's one also really interesting. 9:45 p.m., May 29, 1991. 4 witnesses saw a craft that they said was sort of stingray-shaped, moving very slow and steadily at a low altitude, 200 feet overhead, and it was covered with lights. About 15 lights, they estimate, yellow, green, red, remained in view for about 2 minutes before moving off. Now, one final case for Evansville. This is so interesting. A couple were driving down Morgan Avenue into Evansville. This was at 9:30 p.m. on August 17, 2008. And this is when they noticed a few cars had pulled over and were looking over the nearby cornfields. So this intrigued them, and looking in that direction, they saw 2 very unusual, bright yellowish lights just above and in front of a nearby grove of trees. So they moved onto a side road to get a closer look. And this is when the witness's boyfriend said, "It's moving towards us." So they stopped the car, frightened, until this object started moving away, and then they followed it again. Next thing they knew, they come around a corner, and it's very close. And they can now see that it was, quote, this big, long, fat, cigar-shaped thing. It was huge. Lights were going down the sides of it, and they were going in a row down the side. I was so scared. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. This thing was the size of an airplane, shaped like an airplane without any wings. A big, fat, whitish cigar. It was so close to us. It went down behind the trees, looking like it was landing, but it made absolutely no noise. I kept telling my boyfriend, "Go, go, go!" He drove fast, and finally we made it back to the main highway. The witness did say that these lights were really unusual and had this weird way of flickering down the sides. But as she says, quote, "It was the scariest night of our lives. It changed my life." Thank you again, Bruce Wright. That was amazing. I always learn stuff. Just when I think I've heard it all, a new case comes along that really makes me scratch my head and say, what is going on here? It's amazing to me. Our planet is being visited so much. It's really astonishing. I'm surprised that this isn't front page news every day. It's starting to get there. We're definitely making strides towards this subject going mainstream and being fully accepted, but I don't think we're where we need to be yet. So let's go to the last and final location in this little collection, which is Kalispell, Montana. Some really important cases in this one. Thank you, Brilliant Design, for suggesting this location. Such a beautiful area. Really loved exploring these cases. There's a couple of here that are very significant. I also found some audio recordings, so you get to hear directly from the witnesses themselves, which always makes this more interesting. So let's see what Kalispell, Montana has to offer. The first Kalispell, Montana encounter to get any widespread publicity was a really dramatic sighting that definitely caught the attention of the Air Force. It began at 9:20 p.m. on September 3rd, 1956, when a gentleman by the name of Eddie Geddes, he's a former commander of the Civil Air Patrol, he and his wife noticed a brilliant orange object hovering in the sky as they were driving into Kalispell. So he stopped his car, got out, and watched this object move partly across the sky, slow down, turn to the north. He and his wife watched it fade, change position, move south, gain altitude. As he says, it was circular and very bright. He described it as being almost bowl-shaped, and it was so bright it was sending out little fingers or rods of light. He said it would flare up and then fade out. At times, he said it moved erratically and with great speed. So he could see that this was very unusual, and he started to call other people once he got into town. As he says, he did this, quote, so that I wouldn't be the only one who had gone berserk. He called off-duty fireman Charles Hathaway, who observed it through a spotting scope and described it as, quote, extra brilliant. He informed the Ground Observer Corps tower, who related to the Air Force Filter Center. One GOC member said it was infinitely brighter than any other planet she had ever observed, and she told the Air Force emphatically that this was not a planet. So a lot of people were viewing this thing. Finally, at 10:30 p.m., Sergeant Carl Clark was notified. He observed the object, saying it was, quote, triangular in shape with a bright yellow glow. With him was Sergeant John D'Alessio, who agreed upon the description. They estimated it was hovering at about 4,000 feet, maybe 7 miles southwest of Kalispell. They watched as it moved slightly back and forth, and then east and west. Both said it had a metallic appearance. Others described it as having a tear shape. Some said it looked a little fuzzy or hazy. Some described it having a little bit of a tail to it. Several witnesses said it appeared to flash colors, sometimes red, sometimes green or white. Finally, at 12:45 a.m., this is hours into the sighting, 5 Starfire jet interceptors arrived from Malmstrom Air Force Base to intercept the object, which by now had moved slowly down the range of mountains. A Cap commander saw it, and he said it was dangling back and forth and jerking up and down at high speed. This object was still clearly visible, though it did not appear on radar. Now, the jets couldn't find it because it would apparently fade from sight when they appeared, and there was also some cloud cover which made vectoring into this object difficult. So what was weird about this is the cloud cover wasn't that dense. Witnesses said that they could see the stars through the clouds. So apparently this object was blinking out when the jets approached. Eddie Geddes, the original witness, said he watched this object until 2 a.m. But it turns out the Air Force officers who were watching this thing said it remained in view till about 5 or 5:30 a.m., at which point they saw it move off to the west, though there are some reports it moved off to the east, so there's some conflicting reports here. But in any event, it disappeared with daylight. Of course, debunkers came out. A Montana University astronomer tried to explain away the sighting as Mars, apparently ignoring the fact that Ground Observer Corps members Eddie Geddes and others saw this thing moving. Eddie, of course, disagreed with the astronomer and said, I'm no astronomer, but I know that stars don't travel north and south. I mean, this thing was visible for at least 7 to 8 hours. And you can see the Blue Book reports here. They treated this thing very seriously, spent quite some time investigating it, and again, scrambled Starfire jets after it, which you probably wouldn't do for something like Mars or anything conventional. But ultimately, and get this, Air Force Project Blue Book wrote that, quote, after a full investigation of this sighting, this headquarters concurs with the investigating officer that the sighting was caused by the planet Mars. Such a shame. Blue Book is clearly not an investigative body that we can take seriously. Quite a few sightings in Kalispell. Here's another, 11:15 p.m. on June 24, 1964. Douglas Duncan and his wife were watching TV when suddenly their TV set, quote, went crazy. So they ran outside and were amazed to see a formation of objects, a whole echelon, moving very low on the horizon to the southwest. And as Douglas says, the objects looked like long fat cigars at the angle where we saw them. At each end was a bright light. Between the two bright end lights were evenly spaced smaller lights. Here's a drawing which they said looked very similar to what they saw. They watched them for about 5 minutes until they moved out of sight. Another Kalispell witness is Betty Lee Jones. She became very interested in UFOs after having many sightings. Throughout the early 1970s, she saw many UFOs. Not only her, but the people around her. And as Betty says, we had become so used to these lights that we never bothered to report them. She ended up documenting many of these anomalous light sightings. One particularly interesting one occurred on January 2nd, 1973, when, as Betty says, I again saw a red cigar-shaped object. 7 of us saw this one. I watched it through binoculars and could see the shape. Here is a sighting of a UFO, which occurred just after midnight on August 11, 1976, over Kalispell, which caused at least 4 people to call the police. Each caller said that they saw this glowing object which would change colors as it moved across the sky. That same year, September 18, 1976, a Kalispell resident called the National UFO Reporting Center to describe her sighting of 2 UFOs. Now I'd like to play for you a little audio tape of this witness calling the National UFO Reporting Center. This audio tape lasts about 5 minutes, but I think you'll find it quite interesting.
Well, this was, like she said, 2 o'clock it would have been Saturday morning. And I saw it from Summers, which is about 10 or 15 miles from the mountain range. And it was a big orange glow up on top of the highest peak. And there was a separate orange glow on this side which would have been on the west side of the mountain.
Uh-huh.
And, I probably watched that for maybe 10 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes, I don't know. And then from the east side came 2 great big headlights in the middle of this big orange glow coming up over the mountains from the east side.
Now they came out of the glow?
They came, it was like this orange glow was one big light ray.
Okay.
And then these 2 huge headlights right in the center.
Okay.
Come up over the mountain towards me. This smaller orange blob on this side of the mountains moved up and joined forces with this other whatever that was coming over the mountain.
You mean they merged?
Yes.
Okay.
And then it was kind of a thinner ray, which I assume it was turning around when these 2 joined. And then it went back east, back over on the other side of the mountain. And then I could see the black silhouette of the mountain against this light ray, this orange glow. And then it started moving to the south and up high.
Okay.
And I watched it for probably a half hour, all told.
Okay, now the largest glow, the highest one, did that have any particular shape?
No, it didn't. No.
Just a large glob of light?
Right.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Now how about the smaller one?
The smaller one, they laugh at me. The only way I can describe it is one of these canvas wine containers that they squirt wine into their mouth, you know?
Yes.
That's the only thing I can think of.
Okay.
With that sort of shape.
Uh-huh.
It was kind of a pear shape, yes. And
okay.
I don't remember whether the peak of that pear-shaped object was connected to the other or not. I don't know. I can't say that it was, and I can't say that it wasn't.
Okay, now in comparison, how much smaller was the small object compared to the large one?
Oh, the smaller one was, it was very small compared to the big orange glow.
Okay, do you have any estimate of how big the other one was? Could you compare it with any object?
If you can imagine a big orange light on the other side of the peak of Mount Rainier,
Uh-huh.
something like that. I mean, it lit up the sky to a certain extent. You could see streaks of white clouds, and then dark, and then white clouds. But the sky was just light. It wasn't an orange reflection that far up to see the clouds. The orange was pretty well centered around the top of the mountain.
Did the intensity of that light remain the same at all times?
Yes, it did.
Did it reflect itself off the surface of the ground at all that you could see?
Not that I could. I finally went in and woke up my sister, because there has been a lot of talk in that area of seeing these objects.
Uh-huh.
And then she watched it with me for another 15, 20 minutes as it moved south and up. But she could see the light reflection.
Well, we've been getting quite a few calls from northwestern Montana.
Is that right?
up around Libby and Kalispell and Missoula and so forth.
Just a few months later, on February 27, 1977, New Fork, the National UFO Reporting Center, received another call from Kalispell. The witness in this case was a civil engineer, and he described his sighting of a translucent-looking, sort of Saturn-shaped object with sparkling lights. And I'd like to play for you a 5-minute-long audio recording of his call to the National UFO Reporting Center.
I live about 12 miles northwest of Kalispell, Montana.
Yes, sir.
Last night I sighted a strange object in the sky, and it was there for so long. My wife first sighted it. I have a scope, 75 power to 30 to 75 power. I had it set for 35 power, and I looked at this thing. It hovered over about, I would judge it from the landscape here, somewhere over Tally Lake. And I wondered if you wanted an idea of what I saw through my scope. Any interest to you?
What did this thing look like?
It was a severe,
Uh-huh.
rather like it be translucent, with some little some lights in the sphere itself, with a sparkle, something like you'd see in a Christmas tree light.
Oh, yes.
And at the time it was, when it would stay stationary, it would have a halo which was exactly like the fluorescent light, the circular fluorescent lights. And as it rose or descended, as it rose especially, this tubular light around when it was stationary, was right on the diameter of the sphere.
I see.
And as it rose, the circular light, the tubular-looking light, would go on down to the bottom of the sphere. And when it disappeared from sight, which appears like it was moving horizontally away from us, it would disappear. The light would contract and disappear as it hit the bottom of the sphere. Well, when it was in horizontal position with the so-called tubular light around the diameter, and the sphere was, I say, it was just an outline that was rather almost translucent, as if there wasn't as much reflection coming off it, whatever else is on it.
Yes.
It was brilliant when it was at the diameter of the sphere. But as it rose above the horizon, the light kept getting dimmer and dimmer.
Which direction
I
were you
would say
looking?
that this band of light around the diameter at the brilliance would be about 1/20th the diameter of the sphere that I observed.
Okay. And which direction were you looking?
I was looking due west, approximately due west.
Okay, now, and this object came up from the horizon?
When I first noticed it, it was in the horizontal position, just above the horizon. We're down in a little valley, and we had mountains out there about 5,000 feet.
Yes.
It was somewhere 5,000 to 6,000 feet, and we're at 3,000.
Okay, did your wife see this too?
Yes, she was the one that noticed it. And to tell you the truth, I was asleep in front of the fireplace. She woke me up because of this brilliant light that was just above the horizon as we looked west over our mountains. There were no other stars in the sky.
Okay. You had a cloudy condition then?
Yes.
Okay. Did the light from this thing illuminate the clouds at all?
Well, to some extent, there was around the whole thing there was a halo or aura.
Yes.
But still, the distinction of the sphere-like object was quite distinct. There was a definite outline where it ended.
Okay. Well, sir, we sure appreciate this report, and we'll get on it right away. And if we come up with any additional information on this, why, we'll get back to you and let you know.
Thank you very much.
Sounds like you got a typical UFO in the sky there.
It looks like it. I don't know. Well, my wife and I discussing it. Thought we ought to follow up with that.
Okay, thank you again.
Bye.
Bye.
So interesting. I love hearing directly from the witness. Definitely sounds like an unusual sighting. Now let's explore one final sighting over Kalispell. This comes from Cam Logan, who very recently, he was around 2:30 p.m. This is a daylight sighting. On March 29, 2019, he was driving just west of Kalispell when he saw this sort of tic-tac shaped object hovering at first stationary in the sky. He watched it for a while as he's driving. He estimates it was about 700 feet up. He said it first appeared to be white, but as he got a closer look, he saw it looked almost gray-silver with different shades. And what was really interesting is it seemed to affect the sky around it. As Cam says, the object was pulsating with gray, white, and silver. I got to watch this display for about 30 seconds, and the object started to get smaller, or slowly moved away, strangely. It seemed that the portion of the blue sky around it moved and changed. There was a distortion in the clear blue sky. Very strange. It definitely impressed him. He finally found or had a drawing produced, which he says looks pretty much exactly like what he saw. As you can see, this is not one solid object, but maybe it is, but it's got two sections. It's definitely a very unusual sighting. Thank you, brilliant design. Kalispell definitely delivered some very important cases there. So interesting. I'm just still amazed at how many cases there are on record. I think if you go to UFO databases like MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, and NUFORC, you'll see that they alone have some 300,000 documented cases. But if you add up other UFO organizations like NICAP and QFOS and APRO, and then go worldwide to countries like Australia, of course, and France, and Spain, and Italy, and England, and Brazil, and South America, and Canada. I mean, we can go on and on. There's some 200 countries on this planet. There are well over 1 million documented encounters. It's probably several times that. And again, those are just the documented cases. The vast majority do not get reported. I always ask people when I interview them, did you report your case to any official UFO organization like MUFON or NUFORC? And the answer almost always is, what's MUFON? What is NUFORC? So no, people won't call the police even, or the Air Force. The vast majority of these cases go unreported, which is such a shame. I blame our own governments for this, our intelligence agencies, our military, who have perpetrated a cover-up on this subject, a disinformation campaign, suppression of UFO evidence and information. It's not fair. It can't go on. The truth will come out at some point. You can distort it, you can hide it, you can ignore it, but you will never destroy it. You cannot hide the sky. Truth will come out. So thank you once again for watching, you guys. I love doing these UFOs in your hometown episodes. I always learn a lot, not only about geography, but about UFOs in general. It's always interesting to me also how people react, the wide variety of encounters people have. There's always so much to learn. So thank you for all of you who suggested these locations. And again, I'm happy to look up other locations, just as long as you remain aware that I am doing these in order, and my list of locations is, again, well over 700 locations. So it's going to take me a while to get to any new locations you guys provide. But happy to do it. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I truly appreciate you guys watching. Have a happy new year. And until next time, keep searching for the truth, keep asking those hard questions, and most important of all, keep having fun. I will see you next Friday for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Bye for now.